H.I.E.C. Private Equity Podcast with Ed Fanshawe.
Hello everyone, I'm Ed Fanshawe and welcome to the first of our series of conversations with world-class leaders changing businesses and industries that really matter. As headhunters, we're incredibly privileged to have the benefit of this insight during our daily discussions, so we wanted to record a small sample to share. Amongst these discussions, we'll be covering areas such as food and health tech, sustainability and impact, minority investing and long-term capital amongst others. But today, we'll be talking about data, a hugely important and relatively new discipline with the power to create real value and reduce risk. However, it's often ignored or implemented badly. But why is this? Specifically, I want to explore the value of data in private equity. For a sector built on financial data, we often see funds uncertain about wider commercial data and how best to take advantage of it, perhaps questioning the value they might derive from it or the control they might cede to it. But why is this the case, and how can private equity funds think about and capture the value from data, from origination and talent to fund reporting and sharing best practice? How can portfolio businesses put data at the heart of their value creation plan? What are its limits and costs? My guest today is David Gleason. David is a superstar and someone I've got to know well over recent months. Until very recently, David was the Chief Data Officer for Deutsche Bank's corporate bank, having built data platforms that focused on generating revenue as well as managing the risks associated with the data. His background includes firms like JP Morgan, Bank of New York, AIG, Credit Suisse, amongst others. Welcome, David, and thank you for finding a bit of time between the various private equity assignments you have ongoing.
Hi, Ed, and thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here, and greetings from New York.
It's great. And just to set the scene, please tell us a little bit about you, and specifically, why was data your chosen area of expertise?
You know, it's funny because I don't think I knew that data would be something I specialized in when I started. I started my career as a technologist working with databases, but also writing code. But I quickly became attracted to the challenges of dealing with large amounts of data. And of course, in the days when I started, even things like relational databases were somewhat new. But those early technical challenges of managing large data sets were very, very interesting to me. What really is funny, though, is as I got more and more into it, I realized that the technical challenges were just part of it. And often the challenges were as much around behavior modification and change management amongst the people using the data and even creating the data. So for me, it's sort of this yin yang of having both a series of very hard technical challenges, but also the softer side of how do you manage and coach an organization and its people along the journey of learning how to manage and use their data more effectively. So that's really why I find it so fascinating.
And why is data only really now becoming such a critical discipline?
I think we're at a really interesting inflection point where we're having a number of things that have come together over the last several years. And I can overly reduce it to sort of three major trends. I think one of them is we have a resurgence of new analytic techniques. We have artificial intelligence and machine learning, which have been around for many, many decades. But over the last 5, 6, 7 years, they've really accelerated the sophistication and the capabilities of those. So we have new analytic techniques. The second thing is the economics of applying those analytic techniques to large data sets has improved tremendously with the advent of cloud computing and other things. We can now do for mere pennies what would have been very substantial investments even 10 years ago. So the economics are a big factor in allowing us to explore ways to apply data. And then third, the amount of data available to us and the richness of that data is unprecedented. It's not only the data that we collect from traditional sources like application systems and databases, but it's social media data, it's sensor data from mobile devices and Internet of Things connected sensors. It's even data coming from sound analysis and signal analysis and image recognition. So we are just in a world that is rife with data, and if we can figure out how to take advantage of it, it becomes incredibly fascinating. And then finally, all those three factors feed on each other and create sort of a flywheel effect. Because we have the ability to do more with data, we're now creating growing awareness around data and analytics and how it can truly transform businesses and processes. And that awareness is then accelerating the appetite for more data and more analytics. So it's a great time to be working in the data world for sure.
And do you think that how far down the line of understanding the power of data do you think we are? As just a general comment, it's something that we hadn't planned to talk about, but I'd love your insight. How much more is there to go in terms of understanding the value of what we can do through data?
I have to believe we are just at the very, very beginning. And I think that a lot of what we're spending our research time on today probably will not be where the journey eventually takes us. I look back to the fact that I have a young daughter, and she marvels at the fact that I grew up without the internet and without email and without cell phones. And our predictions 20 or 30 years ago about where technology in general would go were so far off the mark. I don't have my flying car yet, and I'm not sure I ever will. So I like to think that what we forecast around data and analytics, we're probably going to continue making directions or strides in the direction we're heading now, but there are going to be some curveballs that we don't see coming. And I hope I'm around long enough to see what's next in data. I do think that over the next several years, we're going to see continued investment in things like artificial intelligence. The good news for that, to me, is we're getting more and more conscious of the downfalls and the need to manage it very carefully. We're starting to see a lot more conversations about inherent bias in AI models and in inequities in the way that those can be applied and unintended consequences. So I think that we are getting smarter about how we manage and control this beast that we've harnessed. But where it takes us, I have no idea, but I'm certainly going to be interested to see.
For sure. And I wonder, do you have a background that is largely corporate when you first look at it, working through some of the largest banks in the world, really? But you've also built data businesses within these platforms and your own platforms. And you've had exposure to private equity probably more recently. In your view, where can data create the most value for private equity funds and for their portfolio businesses? I know it's a large topic, but if we just start with the private equity funds, perhaps, but where can they get the most value from data?
It's probably too easy an answer to say everywhere, but I truly believe that, like most organizations, there's not too many parts of a private equity firm that can't benefit from the wise and considered application of data. But let's unpack that a little bit. I certainly think that in the origination process, data can play a very big role, and it does for a lot of firms today. But I think we're going to see that expand tremendously. And that's everything from initial screening and identification of targets through to really helping out due diligence. So when we look at something like investment target identification, how does that typically happen today versus how could that happen in a very data powered way? We're seeing companies begin to do things like simply screening social media and screening chat boards and message boards to understand sentiment amongst thought leaders, amongst people who are really driving thinking about the next areas of technology investment, the next areas of economic investment, et cetera. There is incredible signal there that is buried in a lot of noise. Anyone who's been on an internet chat board knows that for every insightful comment, there's a couple hundred throwaway comments. No human being has time to sit there and scroll through millions of pages of that content generated every day. But we can use machine learning models to actually start to wade through that and try to pick out the signal from the noise. So that's just one example of where we can actually use technology to wade through all of this data that can help us find interesting investment opportunities and sort of get early signal on who are going to be influential companies in a sector in which we might be interested. It certainly also has an impact on due diligence. Traditional due diligence relies on shoe leather on the ground in many cases. And there are all sorts of additional ways that we can bring together data to help build a more complete picture of a potential acquisition, whether it's data about the people who have worked there and who work there now and what their journeys have been that got them there, data about customer sentiment harvested from a wide variety of sources, et cetera. So we're never going to replace traditional due diligence, but I think that non-traditional data, for example, can be a really interesting way of augmenting what we might get through traditional due diligence. And I've got one interesting example, if you will permit me the time. I was talking with someone the other day who's looking at how to use imagery, both satellite imagery and terrestrial mounted camera imagery, to start to analyze output of factories. Now, this is not a completely new concept, but what has changed over the last relatively recent period of time is that people are figuring out ways to use higher resolution imagery. So it's not just counting cars in parking lots anymore. It's actually being able to look at the specific configurations of cars produced by a factory, for example, and to, based on that, augment economic forecasts for the output of that factory. So there's some really interesting things out there that can help with due diligence and target acquisition.
One of the problems is that there's almost too much data, because we see some funds where there's no data and some funds where they have streams of this stuff pouring in, and it's almost making sense of it and pointing it in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The double-edged coin notion of this data is very much in play, which is the good news is there's a lot of data. The bad news is there's a lot of data. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes that anyone can make is just tapping into some source of rich data without really having a hypothesis for how they want to use that data and what data is going to be useful. But once you do identify a use case and you think you know how you're going to use some data, we do have the capability now that we didn't have before to sort of start screening that data and plucking the nuggets of wisdom out of the noise in the background. So it's not entirely manual effort, but it certainly does require us to be very thoughtful. You can easily, despite the fact that cloud computing has lowered the cost of data storage, you can spend a very significant amount of money acquiring and storing data and get nothing for it if you haven't been very thoughtful and intentional about how you want to use that data.
I think there's probably a lot we could talk about, but if I come on to more of the portfolio company, the portfolio businesses, where are the critical elements? Where's the critical value that data could add in terms of the portfolio companies, and how can they start to think about it, and how can they start to build that plan out?
The specifics of how a portfolio company can benefit and increase their value based on data are going to be very much dependent upon the sector that they're in. But there are a couple of sort of universal truths, which is in almost all sectors, the market is rewarding companies that are moving aggressively to digitize. And so to digitize, that can mean a number of things, but that includes both transforming the way that they deal with their customers to a more electronic digital means, whether it's through mobile applications for consumer-facing companies or APIs, application program interfaces, to deal B2B with other companies. But it also means taking friction out of their internal processes and automating those internal processes as much as they can. So all of that is very data dependent. In addition, obviously, depending on the sector, there are some tremendous ways that companies can apply data to their specific businesses. So I think the one universal truth that is almost always true is that any portfolio company can enrich its value by maximizing its use of data and its extraction of economic value from data, as well as reducing its expenses and better managing its risk through the application of data. Now, what's interesting to me about this in the context of a portfolio company is that many companies we're early on this journey, and many companies haven't yet figured out how to do this at scale and effectively. So just like a PE fund can bring expertise in human capital management or financial accounting to the table, one of the things that PE funds are increasingly bringing to the table to benefit their portfolio companies is expertise in data and digital transformation, helping those companies along that curve and accelerating their journey and trying to help them get maximum revenue. So this is something that I think we're seeing this a little bit. We're certainly going to see more of it in the future, because this is really becoming one of the primary ways to unlock value in those portfolio companies.
And just while we're on that topic, we see a lot of funds where they bring effectively an in-house data consulting team into the fund. Why the questions are related, but why do you think that the use of data it is not more widespread than perhaps it could and should be, and probably will be? And do you think that bringing, I guess, an in-house consulting team in fund is the best way of addressing that data challenge, both on the risk and the revenue creation side within the portfolio businesses? Or should it be a much higher level advisory board that can really talk to chief execs in a way that makes sense? And I guess related to that is it better within a digital native business or a much more sort of standard business that is going through that digitization process?
So let's unpack first your question about sort of what's the right delivery model into the portfolio companies. And look, I won't pretend that I know the answer to that question because we're still figuring that out for sure. But one of the things that is very much true is that you have to hit both the technology implementation angle, sort of in the trenches for the portfolio companies, as well as senior advisory and helping the senior leadership team really understand how to create the culture, to create the funding model and the environment that they can make these investments. One of the biggest constraints today is simply the lack of fungible experience across industries. Data initiatives and digitization initiatives are still generally things that have a fairly high, unacceptably high, if you ask me, rate of failure. That's because it's new. We're learning how to do this. Every industry is still experimenting and learning. It's not like there is a accepted playbook that everyone can just copy and know how to do this. So I think that where a wise PE fund can play is having a breadth of services that they can both support the detailed technology roadmaps of portfolio companies and help them build up that roadmap and avoid some of the pitfalls of a trial and error approach by using some proven vendors and partners and techniques and architectures, but also to be in a position to really advise senior management of the portfolio company in how to support this transformation and what it means for them and for the culture of the company and for the business model and the impact on their own customers. That's a pretty big ask. So I think that the companies, the PE funds who have created their own in-house consulting arms have definitely taken steps in the right direction. I see a trend away from just outsourcing this to a systems integrator or a preferred partner, where they're now recognizing that this is a competency that may set them apart as a PE fund versus their competition. I do see that those teams will be growing in size and, more importantly, growing in influence. But at the end of the day, the goal is really for them to teach the portfolio companies how to think and act like a digital company and instill that into those companies. This is not a matter of parachuting in, building a system or building a process and then leaving. It's really helping the portfolio companies effect a transformation. So, on your question about digital natives versus sort of traditional companies, that's a really interesting question. I really spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I think it's challenging because both organizations have a benefit coming in the door and have some liabilities. So, if you are a traditional company, certainly going to a very digital operating model is going to be fraught with pain and challenges, right? You're going to have to rethink a lot. And this is not just a technology transformation, although that can be significant. It can change the way people do their jobs. It can change the way you think about managing the business. It can change the way that new products are launched. And it certainly will hopefully change the way that company interacts with customers. And all of those are going to be growing pains. And the real key to that is, alongside the technology investment, is creating a digital centric or a data centric culture. And this is a real transformation. A lot of times people hear something like a data centric culture and they think, oh, that's great. I have to go hire a team of data scientists. And while hiring a team of data scientists may be a very, very smart thing to do, it is hardly sufficient to have a real data centric culture, because a data centric culture means that you're teaching people how to use data, how to embed data in the way that they think, in the way that they make decisions, and to move from confirmation bias to truly using data to help form a hypothesis. But it also means that you're instilling that leverage and use of data into people at all levels of the organization. This is not something that is reserved for senior management making big strategic decisions. This is something that should affect day-to-day operational processes as well. And it also involves teaching people how to play their appropriate role when we are collecting, managing, protecting, and leveraging data. So it's data across this life cycle, and it's top to bottom through an organization. So this is a transformation that a digital native company doesn't have to make because they're sort of built that way from the ground up. Now, All is not lost, though, if you are a traditional company looking to become more data centric, because those digital natives may be really good at thinking from day one about how to embed data. Their challenges tend to be that they're often less good at knowing how to build sustainable, scalable processes. And very critically, how to wrap the right controls and the right risk management protocols around those processes. So, when we look at a lot of digital native early challengers in various spaces, what we see is they're running tremendous risks around the way that they use data and running afoul of potentially of privacy laws or of data ethics considerations or data transparency considerations. So I don't think that a digital native company is automatically going to be more successful than a more traditional company trying to get data centric. I think they have their own individual battles to fight. And it's a transformation for either of them.
So perhaps an obvious question, but we've talked about the value of data in terms of risk reduction, in terms of operational efficiency, and in terms of increasing revenue, producing new products, and so on. How do you quantify that value? Is it possible to put a number, a pounds or dollar number on the value that can data bring? I know it's a simple question, but one I think a lot of people will be very interested to hear.
It's the hardest simple question I ever get asked. And I guess the way I would answer it is absolutely possible to quantify it in the rearview mirror. It is very difficult to quantify it up front. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So, some of my thoughts on this quantification of value are, as you said, Ed, the value typically can be allocated into a couple of buckets. There's cost reduction and improved efficiency through data powered automation. There's better risk management, whether we're talking financial or non-financial risk, or better management of fraud and anti-money laundering risk. And there's revenue enhancement. And that's really the one that gets a lot of people excited, as it should. One of the things I've seen over time is a lot of data initiatives start from a cost reduction standpoint or risk management standpoint, but the outsized returns on that investment are almost always going to be in revenue enhancement. Being able to launch new products or better products faster, or create mass personalization that lets you tailor products to individual customer needs, or just giving your customer better insight into the nature of your complex business relationship so that you can jointly manage that relationship together. These are the things that grow revenue and help profit margins through data more than typically expense reduction or cost controls through data will. Now, when you're going into these things, I think it is absolutely important to have a thesis for every initiative that you start, that you have done the work to understand. Yes, I can do a set of analysis, or I have a hypothesis that I can build a model that predicts customer churn, or that predicts which customers are likely to switch to a competitor. But if you haven't also done the work to understand what will you do with that analysis, what actions are you going to take, and how much will it cost you to take those actions, and what do you think is going to be the financial impact of those actions, you don't really have a business case. So I think it's really important to not just shortcut the business case and say, yes, we can build a customer churn prediction model, but to actually go through the details of understanding what it will cost you to actually take that information and act on it. Now, the important part is that is all just going to be a very elegant hypothesis. You really won't have an idea until you actually do it, whether your hypothesis is correct. So the second major tenet I would say is measure all the time the actual ongoing impact of what you're doing with data, and continue to measure it. Don't just measure it for the first 6 or 12 months after you launch an initiative, but measure it in perpetuity so that you can understand where you have a declining rate of return on something. You may need to rethink or reevaluate an operating model. So that measurement is part of what makes us get wiser and wiser about being able to think proactively about how we're going to build a business case for the next use case that comes up. So I know that's an unsatisfying answer, because it's not like I can say, here's the formula. But I think many of us are still trying to figure out exactly how to quantify it better. But I think the short answer is, if you can't quantify it, then you probably haven't hit the mark yet. The other corollary to that is, if you don't put the analysis you build into production, you certainly aren't going to get any value out of it. So one of the things that also is a corollary to thinking about the value of doing data analytics is you've got to do this with the approach that you're going to actually put these in production. You're going to use these. These can't be science experiments that sit in an R&D lab somewhere. They've got to actually be applied to your real life business and to your live customer relationships, for example.
David, when we think about tech transformation, we often have this slightly sticky situation that we dream up something that's fantastic and you can see the value, but then the business doesn't necessarily have the resource, the human capital to make that transformation happen. From a data perspective, can you build some form of platform at a fund level, at a private equity fund level? Or do you need to do it on a bespoke level and then have chief data officers in each business?
It's a really good question. It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately. I do think that there is at least a certain level of platform and blueprint for a data architecture that a fund can develop and replicate across their portfolio companies. Now, the degree to which that can be very specific probably depends on how similar those portfolio companies are. So a fund that operates within a very tightly defined market space can probably come up with a much more precise blueprint. But even when we're talking about a widely divergent set of portfolio companies, having a blueprint that stitches together some fundamental architectural concepts around what cloud provider you're going to pick, what database platforms you're going to pick, how you're going to structure a data management program, what sorts of analytic tools you're going to create, what are the roles and how you're going to quantify those roles that you need, and the operating model for how they interact, and how you're going to think about and apply data protections and privacy protections. Those things tend to be fungible across a lot of industries. So while there may be pieces at the tip of the spear that are very different depending on what kind of data you have and what you're trying to do with it, there's a lot of work below the surface that needs to be put together. And one of the things I often think about our computing environment today as compared to when I first started in technology, when we worked with mainframes. When you bought an IBM mainframe environment, you bought the whole kit. Today, you're buying not a Lego kit, you're buying a box of Legos, and you're buying a few Legos from each of 20 different vendors. And so there is a lot of assembly required to build a proper data infrastructure. So I think that at minimum, PE funds can shortcut some of that assembly by coming into their portfolio companies with a blueprint. And you may have to tailor the blueprint for each portfolio company, but absolutely you can save a lot of experimentation and reduce the risk of failure by coming with a fairly well thought out blueprint. And in some cases, you may even be able to build and realize that blueprint and effectively bring on portfolio companies as tenants to a multi-tenant environment operated by the portfolio by the PE fund. So depending on the nature of the company, it may make sense to spare them the pain of having to build their own and simply operate a data platform that you allow various portfolio companies to leverage. That, of course, requires you to think very carefully about segregation and data privacy to make sure that you're maintaining confidentiality between the data sets of those different companies. But absolutely is something that is worth consideration.
I'm going to tie two questions together, the last couple of questions. But if there were two or three things that you see businesses always get wrong, whether they're private equity backed or not, what are those things where they just get it wrong and you know they're going to get it wrong? And I guess related to that, if a fund is thinking about how they see data and what they do about it practically, or they're reevaluating their data investments in terms of their team and their resource and how they talk to their portfolio about it, are there a couple of things that you would recommend that they really focus on?
So I think the common mistake, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier in one of my comments about data scientists, and is focusing only on hiring data scientists. And I should be clear, I think data science is a tremendously valuable profession. I think it's something that is growing. Anyone who's thinking about going into data science, I think it's a tremendous career path, at least for the next decade. But we can't fall into the trap of thinking that all you need is a couple of data scientists. And I think that for every data scientist who is doing sort of the highly visible work around building analytical models for data, there are probably 6 to 10 also highly trained, very data centric professionals working behind the scenes at building operating models, at building data pipelines and engineering the data and cleaning up the data, managing the data quality, thinking about data privacy and data protection, et cetera. So the adage of it takes a village also applies to this scenario where I think companies that rush out to hire data scientists without thinking through the broader impact and how they're going to build a sustainable process are going to stumble. To your question about where would you start, or if you're reevaluating your journey, I simplify it down to sort of a three kind of key things to think about. And of course, this is an oversimplification, as all lists of three are going to be. But first, I think is very important, develop a good vision for what you mean when you say you want to be a data-centric, digitally enabled organization. There's lots of buzzwords out there. And the challenge is taking those buzzwords and figuring out what it actually means for your organization. What capabilities do you want to have? What new products do you want to launch? What behaviors do you want to change, either internally or amongst your customer base? What capabilities do you want to give to your customers? So really spend some time thinking about what it means. A digitally enabled organization isn't just a concept that is, hey, we're really good at doing digital stuff. It means for each organization, they've thought about what that means for them in the next 2, 3, 4 years. Second, then, once you know the specifics of what you're trying to accomplish, do a very honest assessment about your current state and your current capabilities. What are your technology capabilities? What are your skills and resources? How skilled are the people in your organization? And this is not just about technology engineering skills. This is about how do people think about the way they make decisions, about the way that they explore options and situations. Are they accustomed to using data? Do we think like a data-driven organization? So it's both the technology and the business process and the cultural aspect. How good are you at this, and where do you need to apply some effort to build skills and capabilities, as well as investing in technology platforms? And then finally, I think is go into this knowing that this is a long journey. This is not a binary proposition where you're a non-digital company one day, and after you apply a lot of effort and time and money, you can flip the switch and say, okay, today we become a digital company. This is a transformational journey, and that means that you're managing cultural change, behavioral change, and technical evolution. And along the way, you need to measure your accomplishments, measure the impact of those accomplishments, and be prepared to make some adjustments and course correct along the way. But go into this knowing that this is a long journey, and you've got to have senior level engagement, and you've got to have the appetite for a sustained commitment to evolve and change. All of that makes it sound very daunting, but at the same time, it should be absolutely clear to most people that the rewards for getting this right can be tremendous. So I think it's a really exciting journey for organizations to take.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave things. I think we could keep going for an awful long time, but sadly, our time is at a close for today's discussion. But huge thanks to you, David. It's 6 a.m. your time. Really appreciate you coming early to today's discussion and for sharing a little of your insight and experience with us. And we wish you every success in your new role about to be announced shortly as well. And if today's discussion was of interest to anyone listening, please do get in touch via the H.I.E.C website, and David or I will do our best to help you. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the H.I.E.C Private Equity Podcast with Ed Fanshawe.